Most people expect warning signs before something terrible happens, like the danger will announce itself, or you'll feel it coming. But in these cases, the warning signs were either ignored, misunderstood, or came too late to matter. A man who hid behind kindness while doing something unspeakable in private. A husband who seemed perfect until his wife vanished without a trace. And a night out with friends that ended with someone walking away and never being seen again. These aren't just crimes. They're moments where everything felt normal, right up until it wasn't. Kelly Ann Bates was born in Manchester, England, to parents Tommy and Margaret. From the very beginning, she was the kind of child people couldn't help but love. She had a bright and warm personality, a Cheshire cat grin, and a way of making everyone around her feel at ease. She was kind, loyal to a fault, and incredibly trusting, almost to a dangerous degree. She was also smart. She did well in school, she was athletic, and had a clear vision for her future. Kelly dreamed of becoming a teacher, someone who would give kids the same care and encouragement that she'd always received. To her parents, she was independent, confident, and someone who kind of marched to the beat of her own drum. And for a long time, everything in her life pointed in the right direction. In 1994, Kelly began attending college in Hyde, and to earn some extra money, she started babysitting. It was during one of those babysitting jobs that everything changed, because that's when she met someone. It was a man by the name of James Patterson Smith, and from the outside, there was nothing about him that immediately raised the alarm. But that didn't mean that he was safe, because James was nothing like Kelly, not even close. See, Kelly was 14 years old, and James was 45, a 31-year age gap, and somehow that didn't stop him. See, James lived in Manchester, in the Gordon area. He was unemployed, divorced, and just kept a low profile. To neighbors, he seemed normal. He was well-groomed, quiet, and house-proud. He didn't drink, he didn't smoke, he attended church regularly, and on the surface, he was a model citizen. But that image was carefully constructed because behind closed doors, James had already shown exactly who he was. His marriage had ended extremely badly after he was abusive towards his wife. He was controlling, he was manipulative, and even violent. She managed to escape before things got worse. But James didn't stop. He moved on, and with his next relationship, he met a 20-year-old woman named Tina Watson. And almost immediately, that same pattern returned: the manipulation, control, and violence. Well, Tina got pregnant, which only tightened James's grip on her life. And even then, the abuse didn't stop. It just escalated. Tina eventually escaped too, but not without trauma. And then came another victim, 15-year-old Wendy Modersad, and once again that same cycle repeated. He chose younger girls, vulnerable girls, girls who were easy to control and easier to isolate and break down over time. To the outside world, he looked harmless, but in reality, he was methodical and patient and extremely dangerous. After Wendy, James found his next target, and this time, it was Kelly. She was 14 years old and had been babysitting at a friend's house when James happened to be there, a coincidence that would change everything. He offered to walk her home, and that's where it all started. At first, it didn't seem like anything was wrong. James listened to her, he validated her, and he said exactly what she felt she needed to hear, and he made her feel understood and safe. But slowly, he pulled her in. Over time, James and Kelly grew closer, until eventually, the unthinkable happened and they started a relationship. A 45-year-old man with a 14-year-old girl. And somehow, he convinced her to keep this a secret for 2 full years. James groomed Kelly in complete silence, isolating her and pulling her further away from the people that she cared about most. By the time her parents realized that something was wrong, it was already too late because Kelly didn't see what they saw. She saw someone she trusted, someone she believed in, and someone she was now willing to defend no matter what. And that's exactly what James wanted. So Kelly, upon turning 17, moved in with James, and she didn't really have any friends. That bubbly, bright Kelly that everyone once knew was now replaced with a meek, skittish, and dull shell of the person she used to be. Her parents were obviously against this decision, but they couldn't do anything but try to talk her out of it, because Kelly was now an adult and capable of making her own choices. James had altered Kelly's ability to make any rational decisions, and she was lost. Even though now she was technically an adult, she couldn't make a single logical decision like leaving James with her life and sanity intact. She was completely reprogrammed to be whoever he wanted her to be. Kelly would rarely be allowed to visit her family, and when she did, she'd be sporting serious injuries, all inflicted by James. Margaret and Tommy tried their best to make her understand that this wasn't normal, but she couldn't get past his manipulative haze. She would explain the injuries away and never really even mention James, and as time passed, things only got worse. Kelly was forced to leave her job. She wasn't allowed to celebrate holidays with her family anymore, and the only thing Margaret and Tommy received on special occasions were cards addressed by James but then written by Kelly. James was seriously playing the most torturous mind games with her family. He kept her under lock and key, and she was rarely even seen by James's neighbors, which shows how isolated she really was. The last anyone ever saw Kelly in the flesh was in November of 1995. And then, nothing. No one would ever see her again. "5 months after Kelly's last reported sighting, a man casually walked into the police station and told officers that he'd accidentally killed his girlfriend during an argument. The man claimed he tried to resuscitate her, but to no avail. While the police went to the house in Gorton, Manchester, and inside the bathroom, they pretty quickly realized this was no accident. Officers discovered the lifeless body of a young girl, and tragically, it was Kelly Ann Bates. And the man who went to the police station was none other than James Patterson Smith. Officers canvassed the house, and right away, they knew that Kelly had endured the worst. Her body was taken for an autopsy, which shook even the medical examiner. There were extensive injuries on her body. William Lawler, the pathologist who examined Kelly's body, said that Kelly's injuries were the most extensive he'd ever seen in his career. And this was coming from a medical examiner who'd seen over 600-something victims at this point. The autopsy revealed that the results, they were of prolonged and severe abuse. It takes a very heartless and depraved deviant to do something like this. Kelly was dehumanized, degraded, and deliberately harmed for months on end, possibly from the moment that she was last seen. The police knew that James was the one who ended Kelly's life, and they needed to know why. And well, James was arrested for murder, and he told the police he only went this far because she was the one who provoked him. That it was Kelly who pushed him to seriously injure her and deprive her. That it was Kelly who would wound James so bad that he had no choice but to, quote, teach her a lesson. Even after doing all of this to her, James still had the nerve to just blame it all on Kelly. Well, James was examined by a consultant psychiatrist, and it was found that he suffered from severe paranoid disorder with morbid jealousy, in their words, and that he lived in a, quote, distorted reality. But that's still no excuse for what he did to Kelly, obviously. He could have gotten the help that he needed at some point in his life, but he didn't, and Kelly paid the price for it. The case went to trial, and obviously James pleaded not guilty. Kelly's family was heartbroken and devastated beyond measure. They tried to stop her from leaving with this man. They tried to persuade her as best they could to end her relationship with him. But in the end, Kelly was the one who suffered the most and ultimately lost her life. During the trial, the photographic evidence of what she went through was shown in court, and in the end, the jury deliberated for just 1 hour. James Patterson Smith was sentenced to life in prison with a mandatory term of just 25 years. He literally put this young woman through the worst, isolated her from her family and friends, and subjected her to literal torture. And he got 25 years. I can't help but think that if James had been reported in the first place by his wife or his multiple previous victims, maybe this could have all been avoided. Now, don't hear me wrong. I'm not putting the blame on anyone but him. These women and young girls were severely brainwashed and manipulated by James, and he's the only villain in this story. But just maybe, if something could have been done, Kelly wouldn't have had to meet her end like this. James gained twisted enjoyment from abusing his victims and manipulating him. But it's still unclear why things escalated so badly and brutally with Kelly in particular. And maybe that's why his previous victims felt as if they weren't able to speak up. Because first, who would believe them? That's the unfortunate reality in cases like this. When victims do speak up, they're often met with disbelief. But maybe in some way, as bad as it all was, they never believed that James would escalate to something like this. But that's exactly what happened. The pain of losing their daughter was too much for Tommy and Margaret. They felt like they couldn't do anything to protect her. They felt powerless, much like Kelly did. That's sort of how this sort of pain works. It doesn't stop with the victims, it's just transferred to their loved ones. Tragically, in December of 2020, Margaret Bates passed away after a long battle with health problems. And her thoughts were always with her daughter up to that last moment, and what she could have done to protect her daughter better from James, a monster who stole her daughter in the most devastating way possible. Well, James's first parole hearing took place in 2023, and he was thankfully denied. We don't know when his next parole hearing may be, but I, for one, certainly hope he never gets out of prison until his last day on Earth, because that's where he belongs, and we all know he will strike again. Before we get into this next case, I want to talk about something that's honestly a little unsettling, and that's how easy it is for people to track what you're doing online. Most people don't realize this, but when you're using public Wi-Fi, your data can be exposed. What you're looking at, what you're buying, where you're logging in from, it's all visible to anyone who knows how to look. That's why I use NordVPN. NordVPN encrypts your internet connection so no one can see what you're doing, whether you're at home or on public networks. It also hides your IP address, which keeps your identity private online. It also lets you change your virtual location so that maybe you can access content that isn't available in your region. And one thing I personally like is that it's just insanely easy to use. You just open it, hit connect, and you're protected. Plus, you can use it across all of your devices, your phone, your laptop, whatever you're on. You can use my link down below, nordvpn.com/TCS, to check out the huge discount on the 2-year plan, plus 4 extra months free with a 30-day money-back guarantee. So there's no reason to not give it a try. Thanks to NordVPN for sponsoring this video, but let's get back to the case. Helle Nielsen was originally from Charlottenland, Denmark, a small town just outside of Copenhagen. And from a young age, she stood out as smart, bright, and incredibly outgoing. She was fluent in both English and French. She was a strong student and someone who had bigger ambitions than the quiet little town that she grew up in. Because Charlottenland was peaceful. But for someone like Helle, it felt limiting. It was the kind of place where life stayed predictable. And she didn't want predictable. She wanted adventure. She wanted to see the world, experience new cultures, and build a life that was constantly moving forward. So eventually she did exactly that, leaving home to study abroad in the UK as an exchange student. And once she left, she didn't stop. Helle kept traveling, working as an au pair in Paris, studying to become a French interpreter back in Copenhagen, and eventually landing what felt like the perfect job for her, becoming a flight attendant. It allowed her to travel constantly, to avoid staying in one place for too long, and all the while, everything in her life seemed to be going exactly the way she wanted. But that kind of freedom doesn't always last, because eventually someone else came into the picture. Now, it was 1969 when Helle was in Miami, and she met Eastern Airlines pilot Richard Crafts. Richard came from a pretty privileged family in New York. He attended private school, traveled often, and lived a life most people only dream of. But despite all of this, Richard wasn't exactly the settling down type. He was known to be a bit of a playboy, constantly surrounded by women with no real intention of committing to just one. He'd also served in the Marines, though outside of that, there wasn't really much that stood out about him. But yet, for whatever reason, Helle was different. There was something about her that Richard couldn't just walk away from. And before long, the two of them, despite being complete opposites, started a relationship. By 1975, about 6 years after on and off dating, they got married and they eventually settled down in Newtown, Connecticut. And from the outside, it looked like a perfect life. But that image didn't match reality. Behind closed doors, their marriage was anything but stable. Friends and family began noticing injuries on Helle that weren't easy to explain away. And by 1986, things had gotten even worse. Helle started to suspect that Richard was cheating on her. So instead of guessing, she decided to find out for sure. She hired a private investigator named Keith Mayo to follow Richard and document what he was really doing. And what Keith found confirmed her worst fears. Richard was having an affair with another flight attendant from New Jersey. And it wasn't just anyone, it was the exact woman that Helle had already suspected. That betrayal hit hard. So this time she made a decision. She found a divorce attorney and she confronted Richard. She told him she was done, but Richard did not let go that easily. He manipulated her and convinced her to stay, and somehow delayed the inevitable. And for a while, well, Helle stood her ground. She was going to leave him no matter what it took, but she never got that chance. Because not long after that decision, Helle Crafts disappeared. On November 18th of 1986, Helle was coming back home after working a long flight in Frankfurt, West Germany. She was away for a couple of days, and after her flight landed, her friends dropped her off at the home that she shared with Richard. She was excited to be back home because she missed her kids, and she was also worried because a snowstorm was due to hit that very night. So she breathed a sigh of relief when she made it back home just before the storm. But she didn't show up to work after that storm had settled, and this immediately worried everyone for a couple of reasons. The first being that she would never miss a workday. This was her favorite part of life. She loved her job, and everyone at work loved her. Not to mention, work gave Helle something to keep her mind off of things from the bickering and that upcoming divorce with Richard. So when their favorite employee didn't show up for work, her coworkers called her home. If you can't tell how much Helle was adored at work, this will probably give you an idea. But this wasn't the only reason her coworkers were so on edge. See, the long flight to West Germany, she was miserable, and she ended up confiding in some of her coworkers that she didn't feel safe around Richard anymore. She was worried about the divorce, and her gut just told her that something was going to happen. Helle proceeded to tell one of her coworkers, "If something happens to me, don't assume it was an accident." I mean, that's not what her friends were expecting to hear, so they were naturally very worried when they found out that she was now radio silent, had apparently skipped work. I mean, she'd never done this just on a whim before. So as I said, they called her home phone and the nanny, Marie, picked up. And I don't know if I mentioned this, but the couple did hire a nanny to keep an eye on their kids since they were always going to be away on flights. They needed the extra help. So the nanny, Marie, told Helle's friends that she hadn't seen or heard from her for the past 2 days. And actually, Marie was woken up by Richard in the middle of the night of the aforementioned snowstorm, and he instructed Marie to take the kids to his sister's house since there was a power outage. Marie asked about Helle, and Richard told her that she was still out working. Now, Marie didn't question this too much, and she ended up spending the next whole day at Richard's sister's house because Richard was fixing the power in their house. Kind of strange, but okay, I guess, but now Helle's friends were even more confused because the flight had ended 2 days ago. So where was she? Well, her friends ended up contacting Richard, and he told them that she was currently in Denmark visiting her mom. The friends obviously didn't buy that because she never told them anything about this trip to Denmark. If she were visiting her mom, then surely her friends would know, right? Well, this carried on for a bit. Her friends kept contacting Richard, asking about her whereabouts, and now Richard started to change his story. He went from saying that she was in Denmark to now saying she was actually in the Canary Islands with a friend. And then he would switch things up again and sometimes say he didn't know where she was. Helle's friends were growing more and more concerned, but they didn't know what to do. Elsewhere, Helle's private investigator, Keith, had also not heard from her since she was supposed to have come back home. It was actually Keith, the private investigator, who ended up contacting the police on December 1st, and he was the one to report her missing. Well, the police initially rebuffed him, saying that Helle was a grown woman, she could come and go as she pleased. But Keith didn't think so. He pulled some strings, gathered his findings, and personally took them to the county prosecutor, who ended up referring the case to the Connecticut State Police. I mean, seriously, if it weren't for Keith and Helle's friends who didn't fail to check up on her, who knows where this case could have even gone. Well, Keith and Helle's friends were super worried for her, as it had now been 2 weeks since she'd last been seen. But what was Richard doing? Well, he was on vacation with his kids in Florida, because taking a breather in Florida while your wife is literally a missing person, and the fact that you didn't even report her missing yourself, doesn't raise any alarm bells, right? Well, the police took advantage of Richard's absence, and they searched the Crafts family home. And they found a bunch of bizarre things. First of all, they found portions of carpet that had been cut from the master bedroom. Then Marie came forward and told the police that she saw red stains on that carpet, and now she told officers that that carpet had gone missing. There were also chilling smears of red on the mattress of their bed. Things were not looking good. Well, something compelled the police to check Richard's credit card activity, and what they found left them scratching their heads. Richard had spent some big bucks on a couple of things. He bought a chest freezer, which was now currently MIA. He also bought a chainsaw and had rented out a wood chipper. What did he need all this stuff for? Well, the police would soon find some of those answers. A man by the name of Joseph Hine came forward and told the police that he saw a man in a bright orange jacket by Lake Zoar on November 18th. And mind you, this was in the middle of a blizzard, a couple hours after Helle had returned home from work, and he was standing next to a rental truck with a wood chipper attached to it. He saw that the wood chipper was running as clearly as he saw debris falling into the lake. But you might be asking, what was Joseph doing there? Well, he was working to plow the snow off the roads that night. He saw all of this while sitting on his snowplow. So the police asked Joseph to lead them to the very place where he saw the man, which he did. And what the police found in that lake was anything but what they'd been hoping for. Richard's indifference to his wife going missing and these weird purchases, along with the possible sighting of Richard using a wood chipper in the middle of a blizzard, made the police extremely suspicious. So they sent out teams in a major chunk of the lake, and even though the mission sounded crazy and no one expected to find anything, slowly the dive teams did surface with some disturbing things. Several items were recovered from the lake, and after forensic testing, it was found that O-negative blood was predominant in those waters. At the bottom of the lake, the team also recovered a chainsaw with the serial number redacted, and on the blade was human DNA. It was sent out for testing, and the blood from both the lake and the saw matched Helle's. A colored fingernail was also sent for testing too, and simultaneously, Helle's bathroom was searched for the same nail polish color, and sure enough, that same color was found in her bathroom. A tooth was also sent for testing, and it was also found to be hers. Basically, her remains were being surfaced by the river and dive teams day after day. To think that it was so elaborate and well thought out is genuinely scary. Even though her body was never found, the evidence was enough to arrest her husband, Richard Crafts, on January 13th of 1987. The trial was finally held in May of 1988 in New London, and it was heavily publicized. It was a very bizarre and disturbing murder case, using a wood chipper to get rid of the evidence of your wife's murder. You don't hear or see about that every day in the 80s. Well, Richard was tight-lipped, and he maintained his innocence till the last second, and we'll likely never know what truly happened to Helle, because he hasn't said a word, but the state has a solid theory. According to the prosecution, they believe that Helle was subdued by Richard via a blow to the head, resulting in that carpet in the bedroom getting stained. And after she lost her life, he stashed his wife's body in that freezer, which he kept in the garage, until he was in the clear. He then emptied the home because, if you remember, he woke Marie up and all but shoved her and the kids out the door under the pretense of a power outage, when in reality, he was getting ready to dispose of his wife's body. Richard then took the wood chipper and the freezer to the lake, where he fed the remains in, and got rid of the chainsaw by tampering with the serial number and tossing it in the water and just going back home, as if he hadn't just acted on a very thought out and deliberate plan of dealing with his wife. The first trial, as unbelievable as it sounds, ended up being a mistrial, with one of the jurors being in favor of Richard's acquittal. The second trial was held later on, and on November 21st of 1989, Richard was handed a guilty verdict, and he was sentenced to a minimum of 50 years in prison, which, if you ask me, still isn't long enough, because he was actually eventually released in January of 2020 on good behavior, shaving nearly 2 decades off of his sentence. put that onto the weird list of stuff that happened during the pandemic. What makes this case so unsettling is the fact we'll never know why Richard went to such lengths to get rid of his wife. If Helle wanted a divorce, and he clearly despised her because he was constantly violent towards her, then why not just go your separate ways? Did Richard really do all of that because he didn't want to pay alimony or child support or something? Well, your guess is as good as mine, but it still doesn't take away from the severity of the crime. Helle lost her life just for wanting out of a loveless marriage, and that alone is heartbreaking. There's a moment late at night when everything feels safe enough. You're tired, maybe you've been arguing with someone you love, and you just want to go home. And when someone you barely know offers to walk with you, it doesn't feel dangerous, it feels polite. But sometimes the most dangerous people don't force their way into your life. They wait until you're already vulnerable, until you trust them just enough. And then they make a choice that you can't take back. Because in this case, a young woman did everything right. She stayed sober, she kept her keys, she asked for help, and she still vanished. Without a scream, without a struggle caught on camera, without a single clear moment where anyone could say, this is where it went wrong. This is the murder of Christina Morris. Christina Marie Morris was from Wiley, Texas. She grew up in nearby Allen and graduated from Allen High School in 2009. She later attended the University of Texas at Dallas, where she earned a degree in marketing in 2013. But what people remember most about Christina had nothing to do with where she went to school. She was funny, bright, energetic, the kind of person who saw the best in everyone, sometimes to a fault. Christina made friends easily. She admired people's quirks, their differences, their personalities, and she made it her mission to make everyone around her laugh, and she usually succeeded. To Christina, there were no small moments. Everything was special. Everything was an adventure. She loved fashion, summer, and James Dean. And she lived by one quote in particular: dream as if you lived forever. Live as if you'll die today. At just 23 years old, Christina was petite, outgoing, and full of life, and had a big heart and almost endless capacity to love all of the people around her. She was a glass half full kind of person, even when life made that difficult. Her parents, Mark and Johnny, divorced when she was still an infant, but Christina never saw this as a loss. To her, it just meant she had two families instead of one. At the time that she disappeared, Christina was in a year-long relationship with Hunter Foster, someone she'd known since 7th grade. They were living together in an apartment in Fort Worth, and from the outside, things looked pretty stable, but behind closed doors, their relationship was starting to strain. Hunter was an aspiring model whose work came and went, often taking him to New York. He loved to party. Christina didn't. She worked full-time, carried most of the responsibilities, and at times even supported both of them financially. Arguments became more common, and the distance didn't help, but still, they didn't break up. Christina kept going, waking up, going to work, coming home, and repeating the cycle. It was hard, but she pushed through it. And then came Labor Day weekend. A party, a night out with friends, and a decision that would be the last one Christina ever made. It was August 29th of 2014, and it was a Friday, so everyone was getting off work and heading into Labor Day weekend. Christina's friends and acquaintances were throwing a party that same evening, and they invited Christina to come along too. Of course, Christina jumped at the chance. She knew that she needed some time off to blow off some steam, since she was so busy, and she was pretty excited. She was looking forward to some much-needed downtime with friends, because she and Hunter had been arguing pretty much that entire day. She even confided in one of her friends about her and Hunter's potential future. But this was a heart-to-heart for another day, because her friends encouraged her to just let everything go and enjoy the night. And Christina agreed. She wasn't about to just let her relationship problems ruin an otherwise fun night out. So she got dressed, hopped in her car, took a selfie, and made the 45-minute drive from Fort Worth to Plano, where she met up with some of her high school friends for a reunion. The plan was to gather around at a friend's apartment and then just see where the night took them. So Christina and her friends made their way to Paulina's apartment, and after a few hours of catching up and having a good time, the group decided to go out for some drinks. They eventually went to a place called The Shops at Legacy, and at around 11 p.m., they were having drinks. They also went to Henry's Tavern and Scruffy Duffy's, and then the group went back to Paulina's apartment, and there, the party commenced once again. Friends remembered everyone being drunk, but Christina was still sober. Since she'd driven all the way to Plano, she had no plans of getting completely drunk, as she didn't really have a way to get back home safely, and pretty clearly no one else was in a state to be able to drive her. She was also a bit gloomy because of the fight with Hunter, but at around 2:12 a.m. she texted Hunter to come and pick her up. But Hunter didn't reply to any of her messages. You might be wondering why she asked Hunter when she already had a car. Well, the thing is, Christina had temporarily lost her keys, which was why she asked Hunter for the favor. But when he didn't reply, Christina started to look for her keys, and she did end up finding them. This worsened Christina's mood even more. Hunter was out with friends partying and drinking in downtown Dallas, and now he was not responding to any of her texts. The last message from Christina to Hunter said that she was sorry, and she hoped that he'd be having a good time and that her phone was on the verge of dying. This was sadly the last time Christina communicated with anyone. A couple of hours later, everyone was hungover and tired, and Christina's friends sent out texts to everyone asking to make sure they made it home okay. The only person who wasn't replying was Christina. Her friends found it odd when calls went to voicemail, but they didn't think too much of it. They thought that perhaps Christina was just running late for work and she'd get back to them whenever she did, but over at Christina's workplace, her coworkers waited and waited for her to show up, but she didn't. Christina rarely missed work, and if she did, she'd inform her coworkers and higher-ups beforehand. Even though the coworkers didn't do anything on day one, on day two, when Christina was a no-show yet again, they started getting a sinking feeling. So Christina's friends called her mom, Johnny, but she hadn't heard from Christina all this time either. Johnny also contacted Mark, and when no one got a hold of Christina, the police got involved. On September 2nd, 3 days after the party she went to, 23-year-old Christina Morris was reported missing. Christina had gone to a party with her friends, and now she was gone. No one had heard from her since that night of the party, and now it had been over 2 days. The police immediately thought this was alarming, so they decided to search for Christina's car. They reached Paulina's apartment, and when they checked the parking lot, Christina's car was still there, locked and undisturbed. It was as if she never made it to her car. But why? Christina managed to find her car keys and she was leaving, but now her car was still at Paulina's apartment. So where did Christina go and how? The police probed more though, and they asked Paulina if she saw anyone leaving with Christina that night, and she did provide some useful information. Paulina remembered seeing a man leaving with Christina. He was one of the people at the party. His name was Enrique Arochi. So now the police had some direction. Christina left with someone. But who was Enrique? Well, apart from going to the same school together, Enrique was a stranger to them. Paulina decided to call him to the reunion too, so as to not leave him out though. But he was merely a passing acquaintance. He wasn't really a friend by any means. The police needed to speak to Enrique. He was the last person who was with Christina, so he likely had valuable information. He wasn't a suspect by any means. The police just needed his version of events to connect the dots. So Enrique was called, but he wasn't of much help. He admitted that he and Christina left together, but as they reached the end of the apartment complex, they just went their separate ways. And apart from this, Enrique didn't remember anything. And he drank a lot at the party, so there were some memory blocks. This left the police with very few clues, meaning that Christina could literally be anywhere. But Enrique did remember one key detail. Christina had been on a phone call with someone, and she seemed like she was getting really frustrated with this person. And at this news, the police's ears perked up. It was a small lead, but it was a lead nonetheless. They had to start somewhere, so officers kicked things into gear and began trying to trace that phone call. Enrique was eventually called back to the station for a more thorough round of questioning, and he did remember Christina making a call to someone, and she even used Enrique's phone to contact that same person at 3:50 a.m. that night. That person was Hunter, but he didn't get back to her. After Enrique, Hunter was also called in for questioning, and he told the police that the reason why he was unable to reach Christina was that he'd lost his phone and was distracted by other things. But when the police asked for Hunter's phone to look through it, he was visibly uncomfortable and asked to leave. This reaction left the police highly suspicious about Hunter. How could Hunter not really even be worried about Christina? And why wouldn't he hand over his phone? The police decided to look into him a bit more, and where he was at the supposed time of Christina's disappearance. If Hunter didn't have an alibi, then the police would see him in a completely different light. So they reached out to his friends, and they corroborated Hunter's whereabouts. He was in Dallas, and his phone location showed him in Dallas. He was not in Plano at the time that Christina went missing. But the cherry on top was the alibi. See, Hunter was out facilitating an illegal substance deal with an undercover federal officer. It's kind of ironic that Hunter's alibi is him committing a crime. But knowing what the police now knew about Hunter, his hesitation about handing over his phone made a lot more sense. The reason why he didn't want to was not because of Christina's disappearance or anything to do with that, but because he was dealing illegal substances, and that too, to a federal officer. So all the suspicion on Hunter died down after this revelation, and the police focused their attention back on Enrique. When the officers talked to the other people at the party, they thought that it was weird that the police suspected Enrique. He and Christina didn't even interact during the party. Enrique, from the looks of it that evening, didn't pay Christina the first bit of attention. And in reality, Enrique had his sights set on another woman named Sabrina. But Sabrina wasn't interested in Enrique one bit, and long story short, she rejected all of his advances. So Enrique, being really bummed about it, decided to leave the party with none other than Christina, as he saw that she was leaving too. This was corroborated by many people at the party, and one of Christina's friends called her 10 minutes after she left to make sure whether she was okay or not, and Christina confirmed that she was with Enrique and everything was fine. The police checked other CCTV footage as well, and sure enough, Christina and Enrique were seen leaving together in the direction of the parking area. But Christina never made it to her car. In fact, 3 minutes later, another CCTV camera spotted Enrique's car pulling out of the apartment complex, and there was no sign of Christina. She wasn't in the apartment complex, and she looked like she was leaving. And the only plausible assumption was that Christina and Enrique left together in Enrique's car. But the thing is, the police were hoping to find some footage that showed Christina was maybe forced into Enrique's car, coerced into it, or something. But they didn't. Christina was walking side by side with Enrique as any friend would. She didn't feel threatened by him whatsoever, and this was making things pretty difficult for the investigators, as they didn't really have any other suspects to look into at this point. But not long after, Enrique's story changed. He said that he and Christina walked to their cars together, and Enrique went his way and doesn't know where Christina went or what happened to her. But why the sudden change in his story? This, finally, was the tiny clue that helped police confirm that they were on the right track, or at least hopefully. There were a lot of holes and confusion in this story, and the smoking gun was when detectives saw Enrique in the flesh when he arrived at the station for questioning. Over the phone, he sounded worried but very cooperative. He assured the police he would do anything he could to help find Christina. But when he stepped foot into the station and the detectives saw him, they were thrown off and taken by surprise, because he was sporting injuries on his forearm and hands, and not just regular injuries. These were injuries that were consistent with a struggle. His knuckles were busted, his hands were injured, but Enrique had an explanation for all of it. He told the police that the injuries came from fixing his car when a tire fell on his arm. And in the process, he got angry and claimed he wanted to hurt something, so he dented his car with his fist. When that didn't sound convincing, Enrique, yet again, changed his story and told the police he got into a fight with someone. We don't know who he supposedly got into a fight with, though. Even though the police were suspicious of Enrique, they didn't have a warrant to check his car, so he was allowed to leave. But the police didn't stop their investigation. They talked to the store employees where Enrique worked as a manager. He'd worked that Saturday, and he usually arrived at the store at 8 a.m. But that day, the day after Christina was last seen, he was very late to work, 3 to 4 hours late. And according to the coworkers, he complained about pain in his ribs, and he was walking kind of strange. The police wanted to know where Enrique was during that 3 to 4 hour window, and a little digging resulted in another crucial piece of information. Enrique was at a car wash, and surveillance cameras showed him cleaning his car intensively. He He would stare at the car for way longer than necessary and then obsessively scrub it clean over and over, like he was trying to remove something. This was really weird, but maybe it was nothing. Maybe he just really liked having a clean car. In the meantime, searches were being held for Christina. Her parents, friends, and community came together to look for her high and low, while the police quietly built their case against Enrique. Also, the gravity of what had happened to Christina finally got to Hunter, and he was beyond devastated. He reached out to Christina's parents and profusely apologized to them for not seeing Christina that fateful night. Ever since then, he's been emotionally fragile and regretful, and understandably so. But finally, in November, the police obtained a search warrant for Enrique's car, and they didn't waste any time checking it and swabbing it from the inside out. The car had considerable damage to the right front fender, and when the forensic tests were run, police found Christine's DNA inside the car. And not just on the seats or something, they found her DNA in the trunk. There was a considerable amount of DNA in Enrique's car. This wasn't just transfer or DNA left behind from Christina getting something out of the trunk. There was a lot. Christina was very clearly inside the trunk of Enrique's car at some point recently. Furthermore, the police also got their hands on cell phone tower data, and up until 4:56 a.m., both Christina and Enrique's phones were pinging off the same tower. And turns out they were both in the apartment complex parking lot at this time, but an hour or so later, Christina's phone was not pinging off any towers. It had been turned off. And with this information, the police finally named Enrique as a suspect in Christina's disappearance. The police arrested him in December, 4 months after the fateful night when Christina went out with her friends and failed to come back home. He was only charged with aggravated kidnapping, but he was held on $1 million bond. The police didn't have Christina's body, and they didn't want to let Enrique get away again, so the best thing they could do at that moment was to arraign him for aggravated kidnapping charges. But in reality, the police were dreading that what they feared might come true, that Christina may no longer be with them anymore. She hadn't reached out to anyone during this whole time, and the evidence the police kept finding wasn't promising either. It was a very hard time for Christina's family. They kept hoping Christina would come back home safe and sound, but they were also mentally preparing themselves for the worst possible news. It's such a heartbreaking thing to experience, to keep hope alive that your loved one is still safe and out there, but also think of the worst outcome. No one could have understood what the Morris family felt during that time. But after Enrique was charged, he pleaded not guilty to the charges, and now he was awaiting trial. A couple of months later, Enrique was indicted on kidnapping charges, as well as 4 other unrelated charges involving underage girls. Apparently Enrique, who was 22 at the time, was dating an underage girl, and the two had taken their so-called relationship to the next level. I won't even bother getting into all that for this particular case. That's a whole other thing for another time. But it's believed that during the party, Enrique was rejected by Sabrina, and he really took it to heart and left the party with Christina instead. Initially, he didn't have any intentions with Christina, but when he saw her getting vulnerable and being ignored by her boyfriend and being in an overall foul mood from the get-go, Enrique tried to comfort Christina, and in the process, may have tried to make a pass at her. Christina, having no interest in Enrique and already dealing with a lot on her plate, rejected him, and as a result, he was visibly angry. He was turned down by not just 1 but 2 women in a row, and this was a major hit for Enrique. Now, while the actual transpiring of events is unclear, what is believed is that Enrique used force to subdue Christina and forced her into his car. The damage to the front fender may have been a result of this altercation. Since the police don't have Christina's body or autopsy, they can't say for sure how she was attacked, but she eventually lost her life after the struggle, and Enrique hid Christina's body in his trunk and drove off to dispose of it. It's also believed that Christina willingly got into his car, thinking he was going to drop her off, but he had no plans of doing so. When Christina realized that he wasn't taking her home, that was when the struggle ensued, and she tried to escape. But Enrique got the upper hand and overpowered her, fatally attacking her in the process, then disposing of her body somewhere. The injuries sustained by Enrique were the result of Christina trying to fight him off, But as we now know, she was unfortunately unsuccessful. The theory is more believable because there's only a 3-minute gap between the two surveillance footages. One is Christina and Enrique walking to the parking area, and the other is Enrique's car driving away. During all this, Enrique still maintained his innocence and urged that Christina's boyfriend, Hunter, should be looked into further. But the prosecution presented evidence of Enrique's sick and twisted desires involving other women, and multiple explicit, inappropriate videos were found on his phone. This guy was just a walking red flag. But on the other hand, the defense only had one thing going for them, and that was the fact that there was no concrete evidence of Christina getting into Enrique's car. So they stressed that the prosecution's argument was just circumstantial. As for the DNA found in Enrique's trunk, the defense argued that it was the result of cross-contamination, since both Enrique's and Christina's cars were tested at the same lab. But obviously, this was not true. But finally, the trial ended, and it was time for a verdict. In September of 2016, after deliberating for 2 full days, the jury came back with its decision, and Enrique Orochi was found guilty of first-degree aggravated kidnapping of Christina Morris. During the verdict, the sentencing, and the victim impact statements, Enrique was stoic. He could be seen rocking in his chair and sometimes even smiling when Christina's family members gave their heartbreaking statements just a few feet away from him. In the end, Enrique was given a life sentence with a minimum of 30 years. But one very interesting thing was the fact that no one from Enrique's family was there at the verdict, the sentencing, at anything, which is kind of odd since Enrique, in his own words, was the nicest person you'll ever meet. But if he's so nice, why did his own family turn their backs on him? Well, now that this chapter was closed, there was only one thing left, and that kept the Morris family restless and awake at night. Where was Christina? By this point, no one had found her, and everyone presumed that she was gone. But her family still wanted to give her a proper goodbye, and not just leave her out there wherever she was. Christina's mom, Johnny, eventually quit her job and made it her life mission to search for Christina, paste up flyers, and spread the word even more. Well, all of their efforts and tremendous amounts of hard work paid off in March of 2018, and Christina's case would finally reach the finish line. But it was still the most tragic end to this case. All this time, even though Christina's family was mentally preparing themselves for the worst, they still hoped that Christina was out there somewhere alive. But this hope completely diminished when skeletal remains were recovered from a rural area in Anna, Texas. Tragically, the remains were positively identified as Christina Morris. Since so much time had passed, and natural elements had altered the remains to a great extent, we'll never know what actually happened to Christina during her final hours, and how she met her tragic and untimely end. And Enrique certainly isn't talking, and he still claims to be innocent and is still pointing fingers at Hunter. But the Morris family, they finally got the closure they needed following Enrique's sentencing. But now they had to take the long road of healing and just moving on from this loss, and the loss of their bright, cheerful, creative, strong, and driven Christina. In 1996, 13-year-old Rachel Mellon Skemp stayed home from school with nothing more than a sore throat. She wrapped herself in blankets, curled against her pillows, and then vanished. Not a trace of her was ever seen again. The blankets, the pillows, even Rachel herself seemed to be swallowed whole. For the longest time, her disappearance remained a chilling mystery. But among her belongings, investigators uncovered something deeply unsettling. A diary entry written just days before she disappeared. A message so haunting, some believe that it points directly to the person who took her. Rachel Mellon was born in October of 1982. She lived in Bolingbrook, Illinois, and attended the B.J. Ward Middle School. While she was doing great in school, managing to get amazing grades and make her way onto the honors list, her home life was a much darker story. Rachel had been the victim of abuse for most of her childhood. Her parents, Jeff and Amy, had split up when Rachel was very young, less than 3 years old. By 1985, Amy had moved on to someone else, a man named Vincent Mellon. Vincent offered to take Rachel in and raise her as his own, hence how her last name ended up being hyphenated as Mellon Skemp. Before long, Amy and Vincent had 2 more children, a son, Jason, who was born in 1988, and a daughter, Ashley, born in 1990. While the family kept good appearances on the outside, What was happening behind closed doors was far worse than any of their peers could have imagined. Rachel was being raised in a literal house of horrors, being subjected to unspeakable evils at the hands of her own parents, most notably her supposedly kind and caring stepfather. Amy and Vincent had been together for about 5 years when the true colors of Vincent had begun to show. To people like you and I, he doesn't look like anyone other than your average guy, no one you'd really think twice about. But for Rachel and the rest of the family, they couldn't help but think about him every hour of the day, mostly because they were scared. They were afraid of his explosive personality. Vincent was a time bomb just waiting to blow. It was 1990 when things began to take a turn for the family. Vince and Amy had been arguing about God knows what when Vince began to grow more and more angry with each passing moment. In a fit of blind rage, a feeling Vince knew all too well, he backed Amy up to a staircase in their home and pushed her down the stairs. Amy went tumbling down, but thankfully she wasn't injured too badly. After she recovered, she went straight to the police and filed for a restraining order against Vince, which appeared to have been granted. Before long, though, Amy decided that she wanted to make amends with Vince and decided to drop the charges against him. I can't say I would have agreed with this decision, but that's what she decided to do. But as you might expect, their reignited love didn't last long, and Vince very quickly put an end to what could have been a new beginning when he continued his abuse towards his family, now turning his attention towards Rachel as well. Before long, Vince was back at his old habits and had now begun to make threats against the lives of both Amy and Rachel. It seemed that, contrary to what he led Amy to believe, he never truly accepted Rachel as his own, and always kept her at a safe distance, using her as leverage anytime the two got into a disagreement. By 1995, Rachel had finally had enough. She was only 12 years old, but she ran away from home. She kept running until she made her way to a friend's house. She never went inside, and it doesn't seem like she ever even knocked on the door, but she found a safe place outside and just slept there for the night, waiting until the next morning to reach out to her grandparents for help. Her grandparents showed up and took her home, placing her right back into the hands of her cold and callous abuser. Later that summer, Rachel was allowed to spend a few weeks with her biological father, who now lived in Texas. While she was in Texas, she begged her uncle to allow her to move to Dallas. It doesn't seem like she explained the full details of the situation to him, though, because surely he would have helped her if he'd known just how bad things truly were. Unfortunately, her pleas fell on deaf ears. No matter how hard Rachel begged, she was later forced to go back home to live with her mother and the living, breathing monster that she called her stepdad. By the fall of 1995, Rachel had begun her 7th year of school at B.J. Ward Middle School. Rachel was quite popular at school, and to an outsider, she was a young girl who seemed to have it all. She was a great kid with good grades, countless friends, and always seemed to be super happy. Only her closest friends knew about the darkness that overshadowed her home life. Rachel's best friend was a girl named Carrie. Carrie remembers Rachel as being full of joy in life, and nothing ever really seemed to bring her down. In recent months, Rachel had taken an interest in recycling and protecting the environment, and even began to dip her toes into the world of music and dance. Her school life, her social life, they all seemed to be looking up, but her home life was about to take a very grim turn. A few months later, in January of 1996, Carrie found Rachel crying by her locker. This wasn't something Rachel had ever done before. No one had ever seen this happy-go-lucky girl cry. When a few of her friends asked what was wrong, Rachel wouldn't tell them. All she would ever explain was that she wasn't feeling well and she had a problem that she would take care of herself. She shut her friends out and wouldn't answer any other questions. This was the last time anyone would see Rachel. After she left school that day, she never returned. She called in sick the following day with a sore throat, and then she vanished. It was January 31st, 1996. Rachel was home from school alongside her stepdad, Vince, who'd been unemployed for a while. This was a particularly chilly winter day, with temperatures reaching around -20, with strong gusts of wind and snow flurries. Rachel and her stepfather were essentially snowed in with nowhere else to go. At around 10:45 that morning, Rachel called her grandmother to thank her for the Christmas gifts that she recently sent over for her. I can't tell for sure, but this conversation appears to have been with her maternal grandmother, her mother's mother. The reason I say this is because towards the end of the call, her grandmother, Lucy, noticed that Rachel had begun to get very quiet. Lucy picked up on this and asked, "Is he there?" referring to Vince. Rachel simply said yes, and a moment later, she said she needed to go. According to Vince, Rachel hung up the phone and the two played Nintendo for a while. After about an hour, Vince says that Rachel decided to go to her room for a nap. She was wearing yellow pants, red slippers, and a pink sweatshirt. She wrapped herself in a blue blanket, hopped into her bed, and went to sleep. This was allegedly the last time anyone saw Rachel, but her story only gets more twisted and more disturbing from here. At around 2:30 p.m., Vince says that he checked in on Rachel and noticed she was still sleeping. The following series of events takes place from Vince's point of view, detailing the information he relayed to the police later that day. Vince says that he left the home after checking on Rachel and headed out to walk the dog. But keep in mind, it's -20 degrees with strong winds and serious snowfall. He says that despite this, he walked the dog for a full 30 minutes before heading back home. But on his way back home, their dog, a German Shepherd named Duke, noticed a rabbit running through a field that they were passing by, and he says Duke slipped out of his collar and took off after the rabbit. Vince didn't even try to get Duke back on the leash. He just walked away and left him there, running off into the unknown. Vince explained that he felt that Duke would find his way back home later that day, but he didn't. Vince returned home about 3 p.m. that afternoon. He says he didn't bother to check in on Rachel, he just went about his daily doings. By 3:15, Rachel's younger sister had returned home from school and immediately noticed that Rachel was missing from her bedroom. Her sister asked about her, but Vince wasn't concerned. We don't know if he made up an excuse or genuinely couldn't have cared less, but either way, Vince never looked for her. Several hours later, a real estate agent was passing by the area when she noticed a dog running in a field near the Mellon home. She recognized the dog as Duke and quickly called him over, taking him back home to his family. This was between 4:30 and 5 p.m. Now Amy, Rachel's mother, returned home around this same time along with their son, Jason. When Amy noticed Rachel was missing, well, that's when she immediately called the police to help investigate. When police arrived at the family's home a couple hours later, they began their investigation with the search of Rachel's bedroom. It didn't take long to realize that something wasn't quite right here. The evidence that had been left behind, coupled with the information that Vince provided, just didn't add up. Something was wrong, and the police were determined to get to the bottom of it. Police found several key pieces of evidence that pointed toward Rachel being kidnapped. For starters, they noticed that her coat, shoes, wallet, purse, and her Sony Walkman were all left behind. These were items that Rachel took everywhere with her, regardless of where she was going. Plus, on a -20-degree day, why would Rachel leave without her coat and shoes? The blue blanket that she kept on her bed was also missing, as were her 2 favorite pillows. After being alarmed by these missing items, they checked the front door of the home and found there were no signs of forced entry. Vince explained that when he left to take the dog for a walk, he had left the door unlocked. So if someone had snuck in while he was gone, this would explain why there was no damage done to the door. But investigators soon noticed something very strange. Vince's arms were covered in scratch marks, some of which looked quite painful. When the detectives asked him where these marks had come from, he said he'd been working on a car earlier that day and got scraped and cut while reaching into the engine bay. If you ask me, this information doesn't make much sense. As someone who works on vehicles more days than not, a couple bumps, scrapes, and bruises are common, but these types of minor injuries don't compare to the scratches and cuts that were described as being on Vince's arms. An intense search of the area was conducted by the police, both on the ground and by air, but no signs of Rachel ever turned up. Police went as far as checking with local airports to make sure she didn't try to book a flight to Dallas to visit her father, but there was no sign of her during their investigation. But this is where things really begin to paint a chilling portrait of Vince. Police began investigating Rachel's bedroom, and they soon found her diary. She wrote in her diary quite often and would detail all of her emotions, experiences, and her abuse. Police were particularly shaken by one particular page in which she revealed several crimes that her father had committed against her. Rachel explained that one day in August of 1995, Vince had entered her room and begun to kiss her, among other things. According to her diary, Vince said that he was doing this so that she would know how predators acted so that she could avoid them. But there was no avoiding her stepfather. At 6 p.m. on the evening Rachel went missing, Carrie, Rachel's best friend, heard the news. Carrie gathered a group of friends from school and explained what had happened, and they all headed out to help search for her. They spent over an hour outside in the blistering cold, desperately looking for their lost friend, but they came up empty-handed. They searched all the nearby streets and parks, but she'd simply vanished. Carrie says that at this moment, all of the friends huddled together and began crying, realizing their friend was truly gone, but hopefully not forever. It was around this same time that Jeff Skemp, Rachel's biological father, received the call, telling him that his daughter was missing. Jeff quit his job effective immediately and got on the first flight that he could to Illinois so he could help search for her. While Jeff may not have been around for much of Rachel's childhood, he was the father Rachel needed all along, not Vince. By the time he arrived at the home of Amy and Vince, there wasn't much that could be done. He headed to Rachel's room and he laid down on her bed. He grabbed her Walkman and he put on the headphones and pressed play. Rachel had been listening to a song called Hand in My Pocket. It was her favorite. She mentioned how much she liked that song when she spent the summer with her father just a few months earlier. Jeff says that while he was at Rachel's home, he confronted Vince about what had happened. Jeff says that the only response he got from Vince was that Rachel must have been snatched while he was out walking the dog. By all means, Vince seemed entirely unconcerned. Ever since that day in 1996, though, Jeff has kept his same phone number, hoping that at some point, Rachel may try to reach out to him. But still, she never has. In January of 2000, a grand jury managed to retrieve a warrant to take DNA samples from Vince. On January 29th, police picked up Vince from his home and kept him in custody for more than 9 hours while they interrogated him and took the aforementioned samples. During their time speaking with Vince, he refused to answer many of their questions pertaining to Rachel's disappearance. He was ultimately forced to hand over samples of his DNA and hair, and police officially began to investigate him under suspicion of first-degree murder. This investigation came after rumors had begun to spread, claiming Rachel may have been pregnant, and the baby may have belonged to Vince. Granted, without Rachel being found, there is no tangible evidence to support this theory, but the entries in Rachel's diary are seriously concerning, and personally, this is a theory I could pretty easily get behind. Vince was also given a lie detector test, and he failed. Amy was questioned by police later on as well, but she found no reason to believe Vince may have been involved. This may have been because she was blinded by her love for him, or could have been because she knew him better than anyone, and while he may have had his flaws, he wasn't a murderer. But if you ask me, I don't believe that for 1 second. Amy was given a lie detector test as well, and she passed. But after this, both Amy and Vince have refused to help police with the investigation, which is a seriously unexpected turn. Amy and Vince both also refused to hold any memorial services for Rachel. It wouldn't be until 2002 when the city of Bolingbrook took matters into their own hands, planting a tree and erecting a plaque in honor of Rachel, placing this directly across the street from her former home. Both Jeff and Carrie have cemented themselves at the forefront of this investigation. While Amy and Vince have refused to help in any way since 1996, neither Jeff nor Carrie have forgotten, and they continue to press on with bringing awareness to Rachel's disappearance, hoping that one day the case may finally see justice and Vince will be arrested, or whoever Rachel's kidnapper was, if Vince truly is proven to be innocent. The Bolingbrook police still consider the disappearance of Rachel Mellon Skemp to be an active investigation. So if you have any information on Rachel's case, absolutely anything at all, you're asked to reach out to the Bolingbrook Police Department at 630-226-0600. Wherever Rachel may be, it's my hope and prayer that she finally found that peace that she was so desperately longing for. Allie Kostial was born in St. Louis, Missouri, but had always dreamed of attending the University of Mississippi. When she was finally given this chance, in her eyes, life couldn't have gotten much better. But then, things changed. Investigators say that there weren't any clues or evidence that could have tipped off Allie's friends before her life was tragically cut short on that July afternoon. Detectives who arrived at the scene of the crime couldn't understand how someone could have done such a thing to a well-behaved, easygoing student. But that's when they honed in on their primary suspect, another student who had a secret agenda that no one could have ever seen coming. Helle Kostial was 21 years old in 2019, attending Mississippi State University in Oxford, Mississippi. Oxford, Mississippi is a relatively small town. There isn't a whole lot going on there. I was there just a couple weeks ago, and best I could tell, it was a town that didn't have much to offer outside of a few restaurants and outdoor stores like Tractor Supply. With a population of about 25,000, it's a quaint little town, very quiet, and certainly a great place for college students to live, as there's only so much trouble you can get into in such a small, lazy town. The University of Mississippi is really the main draw for the town, and I think it's safe to assume that the college is likely where the town gets most of its money as well. The university has an acceptance rate of around 90%, but the reason most people go here is likely because its tuition is relatively low compared to other similar schools. And with the graduation rate of about 65%, it fits right in line with schools that may cost 10 times as much while offering what's essentially the same exact education. This is likely why Helle Kostial was so determined to attend the University of Mississippi. A great school, a great price, and usually great people. Helle was attending college with the plans of graduating with a degree in marketing. She was scheduled to graduate in the spring of 2020, much sooner than many of her friends and peers, as she'd been attending summer school on top of her regular college courses. Helle had dreams of getting a job in the fashion industry in some capacity, though she never revealed specifically what type of fashion marketing job that she'd been hoping for, at least not publicly. Helle didn't just attend the University of Mississippi, though. She wasn't just a run-of-the-mill student. She had a fierce passion that few people will ever match. Helle had helped found the Alpha Phi sorority and was even the president of the school's golf club. If this weren't enough, in her free time, she would also help teach fitness classes in the area as well. I don't know how she managed to find time to do all these things, but with summer school stacked on top of all this, it's pretty clear that Helle was a very busy person. But she always made sure to save time for friends and family. Her mother recalled Helle's dreams of attending the university and said that she didn't only have plans of carving out a great career for herself, but she also dreamed of meeting her future husband at the school. Helle felt confident that she'd be able to find a suitable partner and settle down with an honest man by the time she graduated. In the fall of 2016, Helle believed that she had finally met this man when she ran across Brandon Thiesfeld, a student that she fell head over heels for. But unfortunately, these feelings were not mutual. Helle's friends say that they did their best to warn her about Brandon, but she was blinded by his presence. For whatever reason, Helle was drawn to him with a magnetic intensity. She just couldn't keep her mind off of him, but unfortunately these feelings were far from mutual, but Helle couldn't let him go. Over the course of the next few years, Helle would learn a lot about herself, after realizing how low she'd be willing to go to keep Brandon around. Oddly enough, Helle didn't actually meet Brandon Thiesfeld while the two were on campus. She actually met him in Fort Worth, Texas back in 2016, but quickly learned that he was a student at the University of Mississippi. For Helle, this likely seemed like the stars were all finally aligning and their relationship was meant to be. But tragically, this simply wasn't true. Now, at the time, Helle certainly didn't know this, but everyone around her knew exactly the type of person that Brandon really was. Brandon was a part of the in crowd. He was popular from the very beginning, at least with other guys his age. As far as women, well, as soon as they actually got to know him, they'd usually go running the other way, but that wasn't true for Helle. She couldn't get enough. According to various friends and acquaintances, Brandon was, well, a terrible person. Now, I don't go around throwing insults like this very often, but I'm serious. Brandon was the very definition of a piece of human garbage. All of Helle's friends recall him as being a total tool. All he ever talked about was his father's money and how he could do whatever he wanted because his dad would always bail him out. It didn't matter if what Brandon was doing was illegal or simply immoral, he'd do whatever he wanted all the time, always, no matter who he hurt in the process. One of Helle's friends spoke about Brandon, and while this friend wished to remain anonymous, she described him as a pig. She said that he would use his family's money to do whatever he wanted, and that he'd have 6 different girls around him at one time, sitting back and laughing at them. She ended her remarks about Brandon by describing him as, quote, super misogynistic. Other friends recalled Brandon in a similar fashion. They said that he was raised as a, quote, daddy's boy, and that he had no regard for women whatsoever. He viewed them as little more than property to be played with. One friend recalled that he would constantly badger every female that he came into contact with in the dorms. He'd hang out with them, get what he wanted out of them, and then move on to the next one. Unfortunately, this seems to have been the case with Allie as well. Allie was deeply infatuated with Brandon. In the early stages of their relationship, Allie was under the impression that the two were exclusive, and that they had started dating. But according to Allie's family, she couldn't have been more wrong. Allie's mother recalled Allie coming home from college one day and announcing that she'd met a boy, specifically a boy from Texas. Her mother says that for whatever reason, Allie was always interested in Texas and the people from Texas. So when she met a boy from one of her favorite places, she couldn't have been happier. Allie initially described Brandon as nothing more than a crush, but it soon became clear that they were far more than that. Maddie Norris, one of Allie's closest friends, says that she never even met Brandon. According to Maddie, Brandon always had better things to do than meet Allie's friends and family. Maddie would later describe the relationship between Allie and Brandon as on and off again, but for Allie, Brandon was the only person she cared about. Allie's friends say that she was repeatedly crushed by Brandon. She would constantly make plans with him, then he would never show up. She'd invite friends over to meet him, but he'd disappear just hours before the meetup. She'd schedule dates or phone calls, but he was never around. This all reached a breaking point in the summer of 2019. By this point, Allie and Brandon had been involved with one another on some level for about 3 years. But then Allie dropped a bombshell on Brandon. She sent him a text message and announced that she might be pregnant. She also sent a photo showing a pregnancy test result that came back as inconclusive. At this point, Allie was a senior in college, planning to graduate in just a few short months in the following spring. She revealed her possible pregnancy to Brandon on the 14th of June at around 10:15 p.m. While Brandon always did his best to dip and run whenever Allie reached out to him, this time was different. He responded almost immediately by saying that she should just take the Plan B pill and move on with her life. He added that he had no plans to keep a child, saying, quote, "I do not want a kid at all." Just minutes later, this was followed by another text that read, "I'm serious, no kid at all. It will ruin my life. I will not help at all." Immediately after these texts, Allie set up a time to meet with Brandon about the supposed pregnancy, but he never showed up, go figure. She scheduled multiple follow-up meetings as well, but he didn't show up to a single one of them. He would always concoct some sort of excuse and claim he was busy or had other plans or simply forgot. It wouldn't be until July of that year that Brandon would finally get around to meeting with Allie. But he didn't plan on simply meeting up with her. He had much bigger plans, and a much darker secret. Allie and Brandon had once again made plans to meet up on the evening of July 19th, 2019. At this point, Allie was expected to have been about 3 months pregnant. But interestingly, police found surveillance footage from that night showing that she'd been at a bar. She got an Uber after leaving the bar and was seen driving home alone, suggesting that she'd likely been drinking. This took place at 11:52 p.m. Just a couple hours later, at 1:28 a.m., believe it or not, Brandon actually showed up for their planned meeting. He picked up Allie and the two drove down to a fishing camp at Sardis Lake. According to photos that were taken at the scene of the crime, the two had been drinking White Claws and eating junk food throughout their drive to the fishing camp. Mind you, this was taking place while the two were operating under the assumption that Allie was pregnant. And for anyone that might not be aware, White Claws are alcoholic, and junk food isn't great for a baby either. The two arrived at the fishing camp at around 2:15 a.m., and according to those who lived nearby, around this same time, a series of shots rang out in the night. A woman who was walking her dog reported hearing the shots between 2:15 and 2:30 a.m., pretty much the exact same time that Brandon and Allie would have arrived. By 10:30 a.m. that same morning, a police officer was passing through the area while conducting his routine patrols of the camp, and that's when he came across a crime scene. Based on the crime scene photos and police officer testimony, when he arrived at the camp, he found Allie lying face down on the ground. Nearby, he found her purse, 2 cans of White Claw, and the aforementioned bag of snacks. There was also a jacket placed on a nearby picnic table. When he approached Allie, it became clear that she had lost her life after being hit by multiple rounds at a somewhat close range. The officer stated that upon closer inspection, Allie had been hit a total of 9 times, though 11 shell casings were found nearby, leaving 2 rounds unaccounted for. The investigator said that in all of his years in the service, he'd never seen someone be hit so many times before. As soon as police confirmed the identity of Allie, they immediately got to work on the case, interviewing her closest friends and family members. In particular, they were interested in the testimony of Allie's friends. After speaking with multiple friends and acquaintances, detectives quickly noticed that there was one name that repeatedly came up in conversation: Brandon Thiesfeld. Brandon was a difficult person to track down, but police were eventually able to get in touch with him, and they asked him to come in for questioning. They didn't reveal that he was a suspect as far as I can tell. They purely explained that they wanted to hear his testimony from the night of the crime. But Brandon treated the police in the same way that he treated all the women in his life, with blatant disrespect. He told the officers on at least 3 occasions that he would meet them at a specific location at a specific time, but he would never show up. Once he lied on this 3rd occasion, police got much more serious and spoke with a judge and requested to obtain a warrant for his arrest, as well as gain access to his cell phone data. The judge granted this request, and police began to trace Brandon's movements by using his cell phone. They quickly learned that he wasn't even in the state of Mississippi any longer. He had packed his bags and was heading towards Tennessee without ever notifying them. Needless to say, this wasn't going to fly, so police tracked him down after issuing a bolo for his truck, an $80,000 Ford F-150 that he'd purchased once again with daddy's money. About 2 hours after issuing the bolo, Brandon was arrested in Memphis. As soon as police searched Brandon's truck, things got much worse for him. They found a .40 caliber weapon that he had been hiding, a weapon that matched the one used at the scene of the crime. Brandon was immediately extradited back to Mississippi, but believe it or not, things would only get worse from here. When police were doing their best to tie Brandon to the scene of the crime, they requested access to Allie's phone records. While they obviously found the weapon that was used in the crime, they didn't have any sort of motive, and without a motive, it would be a bit more difficult for a jury to find Brandon guilty. Well, it wouldn't take long for them to uncover a mountain of evidence that simply couldn't be ignored. When they began looking through Allie's Apple Watch and iPhone, they were able to use her location data, her fitness data, and her text messages to paint a remarkably clear picture of when the crime took place, how it played out, and what role Brandon had played in things. They were able to confirm via Apple iMessage that Brandon was the last person to have seen Allie on the night that she disappeared. Not only this, but they were able to match their location data to the exact same location at the exact same time. But then came the most damning evidence of all. When looking at the contents of Allie's text messages, they learned that for 3 months, Allie had been leading Brandon to believe that she was pregnant and that the baby was his. Brandon, naturally terrified, refused to do the right thing and just meet up with Allie to talk it over and figure out what role she wanted him to play in all of this. Brandon pretty clearly didn't want a child, but Allie continued to push him to talk about the possibilities. In the end, Brandon made a rash decision that would change the history of his community forever. Police were able to prove that Brandon, terrified of, quote, ruining his life, decided to claim Allie's life and the life of her unborn baby. Or did he? Well, yes, he did claim the life of Allie. But a shocking revelation was announced when an autopsy was conducted on Allie's body. She wasn't pregnant, nor was there any indication that she had been at any point in the recent past. So what was with this strange pregnancy test that she showed to Brandon? Well, who even knows? There are a million reasons why a pregnancy test could come back inconclusive, but it seems that Allie was riding this train for as long as she possibly could, maybe just hoping to get a meeting with Brandon. But here's the thing. We have no way of knowing if Allie knew that she wasn't pregnant. We have no way of knowing if she really was just stringing him along. But what I find really odd is that for the 3 months that she believed she might have been pregnant, she never bothered taking a follow-up pregnancy test to confirm one way or the other. But the most crucial piece of evidence, in my book, that proves that she likely knew that she wasn't pregnant was her attendance at the bar that night and the white claws that were found at the scene of the crime. Allie was a smart girl. She almost certainly knew that if she was pregnant, then she shouldn't be drinking. To me, this seems to allude to the idea that Allie may have been so deeply in love with Brandon that she was willing to do almost anything just to get a few moments alone with him and try to hash things out. But Brandon was just too much of a coward to face the possible consequences of his actions and just sit down and have a talk with her. And the thing that bothers me most is that if Brandon had half a brain, he could have pieced all this together as well. But instead, he decided to put an end not only to their relationship, but to an entire life. Allie had been working so hard to get her degree so that she could begin her dream career. She tried so hard to love someone and begin a life with someone, but unfortunately, it was someone who just couldn't love her back. Allie had everything going for her, but this moronic monster stole all of that and more. After Brandon's arrest, police came across a handwritten note in which Brandon accepted responsibility for his actions. The note was addressed to his parents, and he explained that he was sorry for what he had done and sorry for the pain that he had caused them. He explained that he'd been having dark thoughts for quite some time, years leading up to the crime. He said that he couldn't explain where these thoughts came from, but that he'd finally acted on them and deeply regretted his actions. At the end of it all, Brandon was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole once he turns 65. It would seem that, at long last, Brandon had finally committed a crime that his dad couldn't bail him out of.